Want to make sure it's recorded. Okay, now let's talk about it. Sorry about that.
That's okay. You want to have a formal
Yeah,
start or just
yeah.
dive
So
in?
let's just broadly just kind of talk about it. So David Hogg, from my understanding, I think it was maybe at the beginning of the year, um, he was ran for vice chair of the DNC, and I think there was maybe a specific one that he ended up getting. I'm not entirely sure or remember which one that is, but he ran for the DNC. He won, I guess, the election initially, and then since then, I know it kind of been was really politicized, as well as there was the internal DNC procedures that were happening. And so I just kind of wanted to talk to you since you're a DNC member, you're on the credentialing committee, about kind of what happened, how all this started, and then kind of what procedures were taking place in the DNC and what those resolutions came to.
Sure. So as folks may recall,
Yep.
February 1st was when we had the officer elections for the Democratic National Committee, which is every 4-year process. The January or the meeting after the presidential election is when we vote for officers again.
Yep.
And there are a large number of officer slots, and including the ones that we really want to talk about, which is the vice chairs at large.
Okay.
And there are three of those positions.
Gotcha.
And you probably realize that we have a lot in our charter, in our bylaws, in our practices. We have a very strict gender parity rule, right? That there shall be an equal number of men and women wherever applicable,
Yep.
right? And so part of what we got to through the day, we elected the chair, and then we elected a different vice chair, and we elected a secretary and a treasurer and a finance committee person.
Yep.
And then we got to these three at-large vice chair slots, and there were my recollection is a dozen people running. And so to also be elected, you have to gain a majority of the vote, right? You don't, if you get 20% of the vote, you're not elected. And we had been there a very long time. And so the first round of voting for the first ballot, if you will, for the vice chairs. Um, and let me say too, for those three vice chairs, we had to have one that was male, one that was female, and a third that could be either gender,
Either or.
right?
Yep.
Because it was an odd number of positions, right? So um, the
So
first ballot, go ahead.
yeah, I was just gonna say, so the first question that I have, because I'm not sure how it's done on the national level. But I know,
Mhm.
as you know as well, right? We got the secretary position that's people are running for in the DPG. So I was just curious, do all of these positions have to be like they're not DNC members like you are, right? They can be anybody?
Correct.
Okay.
For our Democratic Party of Georgia, the secretary position,
Yep.
that that has nothing to do with the
Right.
DNC
But
other
anybody
than
anybody could run for those DNC positions, right? Because I don't think David was a DNC member. Is that correct?
my recollection was he was not.
Okay.
Yes.
Just
So
that's fine.
you don't have to be a DNC member to run. Similar to the DPG elections, if you're a DNC member, you can just put your name on the ballot. If you are not a DNC member, you have to get a certain number of signatures to
Gotcha.
get on the ballot. And my recollection is that was 30 signatures, which that was not a problem
Right.
um, for him to get,
Gotcha.
right? But he also may have been an appointed member, so I don't want to be
Right.
misstating that.
Right.
But you don't have to be a DNC member to run.
Gotcha.
Um, so um, again, we were on the first ballot. We again, let's see, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. There were actually almost 20
Okay.
candidates
Yeah.
running. So the highest vote getter on that first ballot was Artie Blanco with 117 of the more than 400 votes that were cast.
Yep.
So no one gained a majority. So we didn't have any of the vice chairs yet. And that was one candidate we were voting for that could have been of any gender. So on the second ballot, recognizing that with that many people running, it was going to be complicated for somebody to get more than 50% of the vote. On the second ballot, they said you can vote for two candidates of any gender you like. And so that instead of being 400 votes, if you think about it, it's right at 800 votes,
Yep.
right? Um, and so Artie Blanco, who's a lovely lady from Nevada, was able to secure 221 votes on that ballot number two. So she was picked as one of the at-large vice
Yep.
chairs. And as we had gone there, we removed people from the ballot. Where we got into a problem was on ballot number three. So we're down to needing two at-large vice chairs, one of whom has to be a man, and the other one can be of any gender.
Gotcha.
And it was a long day again. At this point, I think we had been there 10 hours,
Oh yeah.
maybe longer, voting. And in the sub earlier rounds, we had removed people like in the after the first round, there were a handful of people who didn't get any votes. There were people who dropped out. By the time we got to this third ballot, we actually removed, in my mind, more people than I think we should have. And we were very thoughtful about removing an equal number of men and women, but we didn't think through that what happened to the math of the people who were remaining. And you'll see why that matters
Okay.
in a moment. So for ballot number three, we had 5 people on the ballot, 3 women and 2 men. And people were instructed to vote for 2 candidates, one of whom had to be a man. However, they didn't designate like the top line is like the male vote and the bottom line is the anybody vote. They just said you get to pick 2 people, one of them has to be a man. So they therefore the men had access to all 800 votes, right? 400 people got 200 votes. I'm rounding, right? I mean, got 2 votes. So I'm rounding a little bit. It was actually 813 votes, but you get the math.
Yep.
So someone had to get more than 200 votes to be elected. The math came out that Malcolm Kenyatta from Pennsylvania got 298 votes. David Hogg got 214 and a half, and the half vote has to do with Democrats abroad and how their
Yep.
votes count. Gina Repass got 112, Kaylin Free got 96, and Shasti Conrad got 92 and a half.
Okay.
So they declared both David Hogg and Malcolm Kenyatta to be vice chairs.
Gotcha.
But the problem is the guys had a shot at 800 ballots and the women only had a chance at 400 ballots. If you think about 2 people running against each other, right? The 2 men running, they had one of them was going to get more than half
Yeah.
unless they literally tied.
Yep.
But because they didn't separate the ballot, like here's the male line, here's the anybody line, they aggregated votes that the men got on both lines,
So
right?
I guess another thing that maybe they could have done, right, is would
Mhm.
they then say, okay, we'll take the person from Pennsylvania, and then they do a whole nother ballot for
Yes.
all men and
Yeah.
women. Okay.
Yes. And the General Malcolm Kenyatta from Pennsylvania obviously had significantly more. And if you look at it, the if you look at the ballots, which I literally did go through, like a lot of people dug in on this math. What I realized right away, if there are 2 men, one of them's going to get a majority, right? 3 women, it's going to be very hard for any of them to get a majority. Again, all of these were very closely, all well qualified, all well known, all worked hard to campaign, would be great at large vice chairs,
Yep.
right? But if you looked at it on the ballots where people only picked one man, Malcolm Kenyatta got 187.5 votes and David Hogg got 104. But 110 people voted for both of them,
Right.
right? So there wasn't a way to like really distinguish that. But the reality is, if you look at that second line, right? If you want to divide it up that way, if you look at the votes for either David or Malcolm, those 110 people who voted for both of them, right? Um, that's not a majority,
Right.
right? Gina Repass got 112, right? And so on. So, as you said, one of the ways that would have been effective would have been to say, okay, Malcolm Kenyatta is our second
Now it's
at-large
everybody.
vice chair, and let's ballot again with um, Conrad Free, Repass, and David Hogg, with the four
Right.
of them, right? But that's not what happened. And so the credentials committee met in May. I think it's May
Which you're
now.
a part
Don't
of, right?
I am. I'm
Okay.
a member of the credentials committee. So that was February 1st when that happened, just to give you some context. It took a couple of weeks for Kaylin and Gina, Kaylin Free and Gina Repass, both um, right away told the chairman that they were concerned about the election and that weekend, and started trying to get the information to see if their suppositions were correct.
Yep.
Um, it took until February 20th before they got all the information, right? Like, so almost 3 weeks
Yeah.
before
3 weeks after. Yeah.
to get the information to be able to put into, definite words their challenge. So a week later, Free and Repass filed their credentials challenge. So again, this is the end of February. 3 weeks later, Chair Repass decided to withdraw from the challenge. And at this point, the main DNC members and the credentials committee members didn't know anything about a challenge happening.
Okay.
So on March 19th, Kaylin Free emailed all the DNC members to make them aware that the challenge had been filed. The next day, the DNC sent it out to everybody. All right, so that's March 20th. March 25th is when Chairman Martin started talking with all the officers about a neutrality pledge, right? Where that he was wanting that all the officers to sign a pledge saying they would not be involved in Democratic primaries because of their position as a national party chair, that they would stay neutral, not advantage one Democrat over another.
Now, is that typical that is done, or because
That
I've heard
that
kind of
is
both things? Because I think when I was watching some of David's interviews, he was kind of saying that that wasn't the case. But
that
I
is
know
not that
it's
is that was a
it's
new
okay.
that was a new measure the chairman wanted, partially because Ken Martin was very heavily involved back in the day for the Sanders Hillary Clinton
Yep.
election, where a lot of people felt like the party had put their thumb on the scale for Secretary Clinton,
Okay.
and Ken Martin had been one of the people who tried to create the compromise for the following year, um, to lessen the influence of superdelegates and things like that, to pacify the, to again make people understand that it was, the delegates who were really making the decision, not the superdelegates, right? So his sense of this problem for the national leadership was before we'd ever heard of David Hogg,
Right.
right? So he brought this neutrality pledge on April 10th. Malcolm Kenyatta and David Hogg both responded to the challenge, right? And on April 11th, the party affairs folks scheduled the DNC hearing for May 12th. The reason I'm being specific about these dates is because after that, on April 16th, is when David Hogg announced his new push for his PAC to be
To
going
go
after
into
these
primaries.
congressional candidates,
Yep.
right? Again, it's not that he created the PAC in April. He had created the PAC the previous year, but the energy had been more about just getting young people to run for office. And he sort of changed the tone of it here in mid-April.
Gotcha.
Okay. So again, all these things happened that weren't, they were related to David Hogg getting elected, but it wasn't about David Hogg. It was about the election.
Gotcha.
So the credentials committee met on May 12th and passed a resolution after a very long hearing. Everybody had a chance to talk. Everybody had a chance to bring their experts. And basically the question was, were the women candidates disadvantaged by that combination of those two lines on that ballot number 3? And
Yep.
the resolutions committee decided that yes, indeed, the women had been disadvantaged and that we should continue the election, basically throwing out ballot number 3 and going to a ballot number 4 that would have all 5 of those candidates. Well, actually, the premise that all 5 of those candidates would still be eligible to run, but that we would separate it out
Yep.
and continue the election and have the next ballot be just between the 2 men, Malcolm Kenyatta and David Hogg. The winner of that would have that second at-large vice chair slot. And then the subsequent ballot would be the loser of that
Yep.
all-male ballot and the 3 women. So those 4 folks would be on the next ballot to pick the third at-large vice chair. So just because the credentials committee said it doesn't mean it's going to happen, right? So on May 22nd, the Rules and Bylaws Committee had to decide if that resolution was adopted, what the rules would be for that new election, right? And so they decided that it would be an electronic ballot,
Mm-hmm.
and that the first step would be voting on whether to adopt the resolution and the rules. And that would be done from June 9th to 11th. So 3 days, like starting at 9 or 10 in the morning and going to 5 o'clock on the third day, to give everybody, again, because we have these Democrats abroad who are in this, that, and the other time
Yep.
zone, right? And they did a really good job of giving people ample opportunity to learn how to use Election Buddy. You know, none of us
Yep.
had to learn because we use it here in Georgia.
Yep.
And so at 5 o'clock on June 11th, the balloting ended for whether to adopt the resolution and then the rules for moving forward. And in the evening of the 11th, the vote was revealed, and 75% of the DNC members had voted to adopt the resolution.
Gotcha.
Which meant that the next day, the 12th, we would begin balloting between Malcolm Kenyatta and David Hogg for the male at-large vice chair position.
Gotcha.
However, on the evening of the 11th, David Hogg withdrew from the election.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so from the 12th through the 14th, so through Saturday, we still have to vote, even though Malcolm Kenyatta is the only person on the ballot, because 40% of the people have to participate for it to be valid. And so that's ongoing. And then from the 15th to the 17th, we'll have these 3 days of balloting for the 3 women, Kaylin Free, Gina Repass, and Shasti Conrad.
Gotcha.
And so basically we're in a very, everybody's sending the emails and making phone calls of those 3 women trying to get folks to pick them. Now, if again, the 3 of them are very evenly matched, so if none of them gets more than 50% of the vote, the
Then you have
bottom one
another
will
one.
drop out and we'll have a subsequent election, which I assume would be electronic also.
Okay. Now, I can't remind me, how long have you been a DNC member?
I joined the DNC in 2012.
Okay, so you were back when Ed Martin was doing the, he was trying to get the resolution for the
Yeah,
neutrality and everything like that.
yeah,
'Cause I know that
yeah.
was something that had been politicized and everything like that, and that wasn't. And I think it's really great that you kind of gave a little bit of that background, because I think that was not heard.
Right.
Um, in that
There
it
is
was
a
just
lot about this story that wasn't heard.
right, which is, I
Um,
was like, I want to talk to Wendy because she's on it, and then I saw you were on the credentialing committee, and I was like, she's the one who's going to know what's going on.
yeah, well, and again, it's like nobody, please don't get us wrong. None of us on the credentials committee, none of the people involved in the election wanted to sort of throw a flag on our own election,
Right,
right? Like it's none of us want us to look like we didn't do it right,
exactly.
but we didn't do it right. I mean, immediately, like I was talking to people that night about getting rid of the parity rule because it felt like we were making sure men got elected, and when the parity rule was instilled to make sure women had a seat at the
Yeah.
table. And I'm like, if we get all the seats right now, I don't care.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny you had mentioned that because when I had heard that had come out, first off, I mean, I'm not super involved with the whole parody thing.
Mhm.
But it was something where I was like, is there even a need for this anymore? And I know
Right.
that I have, I've got some more conservative friends and everything like that, and they're like, do you even need that? I feel like that doesn't make any sense, all this other kind of stuff. So 100% agree on that.
Well, and the other thing too, you might recall, because Fox News and all our friends on the right took great deal of enjoyment when we're talking about these at-large elections and we're talking about parity. Our rules also take into account that there are people who are gender non-binary,
Yep.
right? And how they fit in the puzzle. So God bless Chairman Harrison. Again, nobody at any time said that Chairman Harrison or the people who were helping him conduct the election were trying to make an error.
Yep.
It was not intentional. But you might recall that Jamie had to say over and over again when he was talking about male and female and gender non-binary, male and female and gender non-binary. He like had to say that over and over and over
Yep.
again. And actually, for this at large, one of the candidates had again, everybody self-selects their gender,
Yep.
right? And one candidate had, checked gender non-binary, and that person, however, did not advance after the first ballot because they didn't get enough votes. Not because of that, but because they weren't a DNC member and
Right.
didn't have, the relationships that the other candidates did. So anyway, so here we are. We have now, when Malcolm Kenyatta, hopefully 40% of the people will participate, and he'll be elected to that at-large slot. And so again, David Hogg, if he had not prevailed over Malcolm, would have had the opportunity to run against the ladies um, in this final, hopefully final
Yep.
segment, right? But it'll be the three women who are facing off against each other from the 15th to the 17th for that third vice chair slot.
Did David make a statement or anything like that? Like I said, I just saw this the other day, but did he make a statement as to why he was dropping out of the next race? Um,
Um, I, he didn't send anything to the DNC
okay.
members, but his he has been presenting to the media throughout this whole process that this was being done to get rid of him.
Right.
And although there may be people who aren't sad that he's gone, I will assure you that the energy and the push from this was about the women being disadvantaged on February 1st. It was
Gotcha.
not about what David Hogg's pack is doing,
Yeah.
and or a reflection on how he had served in this 100 and however many days that he has been one of the vice chairs.
Yeah. And I think that was kind of, and just one of the more frustrating things for me is that when I heard there was these challenges and it was all politicized and everything like that, and this is as DPG and everything like that, when we were going through the bylaws, it's like, hey, we want to get this done quick. That way we can kind of move on and start prepping for the next election. And obviously, within March and April, it's not like there was any big like national stuff going on. So it was, which I'm being sarcastic, but
Right.
it's one of those where it's like we really just kind of needed to get this done and then
Yes.
move on so we can start actually trying to win.
Yeah.
And so when these kind of things happen and it gets kind of dragged out,
Yeah.
and obviously, like you said, like Fox and whoever, coming
Yeah.
in and just trying to dunk on everybody. For me, it was kind of like these are the things that like this is shooting yourself in the foot because you kind of want publicity, but it's like you don't want publicity. You don't necessarily want negative publicity when it comes to your
Right.
organization and people
Right.
losing faith in your organization.
And again, it for the genesis of where this challenge came from, it wasn't like oh, we don't like them. It was again based on what happened on February 1st, that we didn't feel like the women had a fair shot.
Yep.
And this was again a very talented pool. There were a dozen people who were very strongly supported and had, background in history and an interesting um, angle that they were bringing, to this opportunity of us selecting a slate of officers that well represents our entire country, which, as you know, is hard to do,
Yeah.
right? You know, so, there were people from Florida who were heavily lobbying for David because he was from Florida,
Right.
right? Like, in addition to people who were lobbying for David because he was young, right? And so there were, and so now these three women we have. Kaylin Free is Native American, and we've never had a Native American officer of the party. And she's also, done a lot of work,
Yeah, I was
done a
gonna say,
lot
can
of
you talk a little bit about what the
yeah,
other candidates do? Because like I
sure,
guess that's also one other thing that I think is kind of lost in a lot of this, where it's like, and I'm not, like I said, I
yeah,
personally, I'm not trying to attack David or anything like that, but it's like I know what he's done with, I forget, I think it was Leaders We Deserve, maybe was the group,
okay,
um, and or it was either that or like, it wasn't March of Dimes, but it was one of those organizations that he did. But it's like it kind of gets lost in. We also elected two other people as vice chairs, and they've also
right,
done a lot for the organization and things like that. So
right.
can you just kind of talk a little bit about kind of like I guess the two that I guess will
We're
now be
elected.
elected, and
Yeah.
then the rest that
So
aren't going to be, or that will be in the on the next ballot.
sure. Well, I can say a couple of things. Artie Blanco is from Nevada. She was elected on that second ballot.
Yep.
Um, and she's been very active in Nevada. My recollection is she's state party chair, and I apologize for not knowing for
No,
sure.
that's fine.
She also has very strong ties for labor and has and is a Latina, right? And has just been a really dynamic and engaged member of the DNC. And she's an officer on, I think, the Women's Caucus. She's a vice chair. And so very well known and well regarded through the DNC. Malcolm Kenyatta is a DNC member from Pennsylvania. He's a state legislator from Pennsylvania. He's under 40. I don't know where in his 30s he is, but really dynamic African American who also happens to be gay, and had a lot of support from the Northeast, right? And a lot of people in the African American caucus, right? And really dynamic, a terrific speaker. I really love hearing Malcolm speak. And so, David Hogg, unfortunately, was a part of
Parkland.
the Parkland shooting, and then a very devoted and active member of one of the anti-gun groups, and did a lot of good work, raised a lot of money, worked really hard to get a lot of younger candidates elected last cycle, put together this PAC, which again started with just the premise of electing young people to office at all layers of the ballot. And he didn't really turn his attention or his rhetoric to, we got to get rid of these old guys who are just hanging on to these seats in democratically controlled areas.
Yep.
He didn't start that pitch until April. So, and it certainly wasn't part of his campaigning to be one of the vice chairs. His campaign was, frankly, it was about we need younger people, and that he had done the work, particularly on these school safety and gun issues, right? So then we're down, and there were people who have been active and involved. Again, it was a very talented slate of folks. It was hard to pick just three, right? Like, I'm like, can I pick five or six?
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
all so good. So let's do it alphabetically. Shasti Conrad, she is the chair of the Washington State Democratic Party, who has really, they've just been building and building and building, have a lot of great energy. I think all their statewide offices are now held by Democrats, and she did a really good job building up the party in Washington State. Um, she is of she's Asian American, right? And has worked hard in the caucus there, and dynamic and young. Kaylin Free, again, who ended up being the only person with the challenge when Gina Repass dropped out of the challenge. Um, she is Native American. I said we've never had an officer who's Native American in the party at the national level. And she's been active in Oklahoma, and also active. She put together a PAC that trains and elevates Native American candidates to run for office and has been very successful, has raised millions of dollars in that effort. And also, one of the claim to fames that happened really close to this election is she got the first African American elected mayor of a big city in Oklahoma. I don't know if it was Oklahoma City right now or
Also,
Tulsa. No, Tulsa. It was
also,
Tulsa. That's right. Um, so anyway, again, also very well qualified. And then Gina Repass is the chair in Nebraska, and African American, and has done great work in Nebraska. A lot of us from rural areas were excited about all these folks who have represented rural areas running. And we haven't had a lot of people from rural areas in our national leadership, to be honest with you,
yep.
right? It
No,
tends
I
to
agree.
be from the big blue states, right? And also, if you recall, and unfortunately, that weekend that we were there in Maryland, that last weekend in January 1st of February, was when there was that dreadful plane crash at the national airport there in
Yes. Yep.
DC.
Yep.
And I don't know if you know, but there were a lot of people from Nebraska on that flight because they had been, it was some ice skating group
Yeah,
or something.
it was some sporting out, some
Yeah.
sporting. I don't want to say group, but some team or something that was associated with that. I remember that was a big one.
Yeah. And so again, she was handling a lot that weekend and really, again, held herself beautifully and elegantly and in all the right ways, compassionately toward the families, and also about, then when Trump did the foolishness of saying, DEI was the reason for the crash, right? Like, as an African American woman, she was like, step back, sir, right? Like, it was. So we've got really talented, capable people who are running for this third vice chair slot, and it's not clear. Again, I would not be surprised if none of them achieve the majority vote, and we have to go to an
Another
additional
bad.
ballot to get there. They're very well qualified. Again, different parts of the country, um, different dynamics. I think there are people who will be glad that Kaylin Free stood up to make this challenge to give the women a fair shot at this position. And I think there will be people who say, Kaylin Free, you caused a mess and we didn't need a
Yep.
mess. So there's that sort of dynamic involved as well. So we will see how things turn out. We will find out on the 17th in the evening.
Yep. So real quick, we've got
Mhm.
5 minutes left, so let's take
Yeah.
two or three, or let's actually just take two. If you can summarize real quick, what does the vice chair of the DNC do?
Great question. So we have,
I should have started with that one.
yeah, we actually have five vice chairs.
Yep.
The person who is the head of the Association of Democratic State Chairs
Hmm.
um, is a vice chair, but the state chairs are the ones who pick that person. The
Yep.
whole DNC doesn't. There's a vice chair that's named. I think it's like the voter engagement and civic
Right.
engagement one, and I forget the title. That's the one Chair Williams, Nikki Williams had run for and didn't get. I also call it the Donna Brazil vice chair, right? And they have a very specific function of civic engagement and the voter protection work,
Gotcha.
right? The other three vice chairs are like they're not numbered one, two, three. They are at large. Again, it's a way for us to make sure that all corners of the country have representation, all pieces of our party have representation. And generally, they're given portfolios that match their
Skill
work,
set.
right? So if Kaylin is elected, it'll certainly be elevating Native American candidates and sort of a Midwestern rural thing because she's done so much work in rural areas because of all the Native American work she's done, right? I think if it's Gina Repass, again, she's Midwestern, and also a state party chair. So making sure we're working on the year-round organizing, which we were hoping that more and more states adopt, and the national party is giving more money, hopefully hoping that that funding will help make that happen. And then Shasti Conrad, again, young, great energy, and and is from the Asian American community. And so we'll probably have, again, they'll have different portfolios, but basically they're, a part of the executive committee and have responsibilities there. But we're doing these town halls all across the country, right? Trying to go to places where the Republicans won't show up.
Yep.
And we're making sure there's energy to show up there. So, like, I know Malcolm has been doing a lot of that as the at large vice chair. So,
Okay.
um, or sometimes they just sit at the DS at a meeting.
Yep.
And that's not what any of us want. We were
Right.
trying to get people who were going to be workers and doers. And I think we have that in all these people who are still in the running for this position.
Okay. Well, let's leave it there. Thank you so much, Wendy. Like I said,
Yeah.
these are the
Thank you
things
for
that
your
I wanted to
interest.
know. There's all these little challenges and there's all these little questions. And so I wanted to get someone who knew what was going on because I think just like you said, just some of the detail that you had given me kind of helped me understand, okay, no, this is actually what's going on. It's not just some power grab or something like that. So thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. And do give Malcolm Kenyatta a look.
Yep.
He's really dynamic. I think you'll be impressed with him, and our officers are working hard.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.